over the course of my last two programs, I have spent much time discussing the astonishing contents of a telephone conversation that took place between two German generals, discussing the possible deployment and provision of Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and discussing attacks with those Taurus missiles on the Kerch Bridge, with German involvement, and further discussions in the event that an attack on the Kerch Bridge itself does not take place, further attacks alternatively on Russian locations in Krasnodar Krai, the region to the southeast of Ukraine, or Donbass, which lies firmly within, and which even Germany acknowledges and the West acknowledges to be part of the Russian Federation. Well, the story has been a big story in Germany. It's been reported in the media there, but it's been a very interesting take, because rather than discussing the astonishing content of this conversation, the fact that the German officers were discussing possible strikes on the Kerch Bridge with German involvement, and potential strikes upon Russia itself, Russia being a nuclear power, the most powerful military power on the European continent, a country with which Germany has had, shall we say, an unhappy history of war. Instead of discussing those topics, what the German media, so far as I can see, appears to have mainly focused on is the surely secondary question of how the Russians got hold of this recording. Well, as to that, I said yesterday that it was absolutely clear to me that the German officers had not taken proper precautions. We learned from the Financial Times that they used a particular platform with which to conduct this conversation. I know nothing about these platforms. I know nothing about that kind of thing. But clearly this was a conversation conducted over a compromised line, given the ubiquity of intelligence and hacking and cyber issues. One would have expected that German officers, senior German officers, would be more careful about conducting discussions like this. But anyway, so far, to all appearances, the investigation is going to be principally about how this information came to light rather than the information itself. It reminds me, I have to say, a little bit, to a certain extent, about the Nord Stream investigations set up. It's quite clear that before long they are investigations in form only. Two of them, the one conducted by Sweden and the one conducted by Denmark, have closed without disclosing any findings or producing any results. The German investigation continues, but without apparently any real enthusiasm. And I can't help but think that in this particular case, this latest investigation is a way of kicking this whole topic of this conversation into the long grass. It gives the German government a way to come out and say, well, we're not able to discuss this conversation any further because, of course, it is now the topic of an investigation. So we have to wait until that investigation is concluded and we have the report. And, of course, when the report comes, we will be told that the report is classified and cannot be discussed publicly, and the whole thing will be quietly left to drop. Now, there are a number of points that I do want to make about this affair. Firstly, the German government has admitted that this conversation did indeed take place, that it is a real conversation. About that, having heard it, I had no doubt at all, and people who are familiar, much more familiar with these kind of matters than me, and who have been in contact with me, when they also heard this conversation and saw the transcript, they were quite clear also that this was an authentic, a real conversation between two German generals. So that's one thing. The German government has admitted that this conversation is real. The German government, again, trying to draw attention away from the actual content of the conversation itself, says that they don't know whether or not its content has been manipulated, whether things have been inserted into the conversation which were not actually said. Well, it's very easy to find that out. You just ask the two generals in question. I'm sure that over the last couple of hours, both generals have been questioned and briefed about this affair. I am sure that those generals have confirmed that the conversation not only took place, but is, as the recording says, if it were otherwise, if there were actual evidence that the recording had been manipulated and things had been said or appeared to have been said which were not actually said, well, by now the German government would already be telling us of this. Again, this is another mechanism to try to draw attention away from the discussion that takes place in the conversation itself. So that's the second thing. And of course, in all other respects, German officials, the German government, apparently as of last night, I don't know whether this is still the case today, has adopted the standard Western policy of omerta, not to discuss information like this, which is embarrassing. So a wall of silence in all other respects has descended. Now, as to the latter, there was a very interesting article that I read somewhere. It was in the American media, might have been in the independent media in the United States rather than the mainstream media. But it made the point, and I don't remember who wrote this article, by the way, but it made the point that Western officials have discovered that whenever they're caught out, whenever some debacle or disaster happens, the way to contain the damage and to avoid any accountability is for everybody to remain totally silent about what has happened, and to the extent that it is discussed at all, for everybody within the governmental and political system, and by the way, the media establishment as well, whenever the topic is discussed at all, if it has to be discussed, to maintain a stance of outright denial. So as a result, whatever took place disappears into a memory hole, and we're able to move on to the next debacle and the next war. And I think this is true, and I don't think it is only true of Germany or of the United States. It is becoming increasingly true of all countries, of all Western countries. And this, I suspect, partly explains why the political class and the media class, of course the two are deeply interconnected with each other, is so antagonistic to outsiders. One of the reasons why they're so antagonistic to outsiders when they appear on the scene. Because, of course, these outsiders are not bound by the same principle of omerta. And of course, if they are able to break into the parliament, if they're able to acquire a platform, if they can reach out to people, well, then, of course, it becomes much more difficult, all but impossible, in fact, to conduct this type of operation. And that doubtless explains the astonishing reaction in London to the by-election victory in Rochdale of the dissident, veteran British politician George Galloway. There's been astonishing comments said about him, but more interesting of all is an utterly bizarre, indeed incredible speech that was given by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on the steps of Downing Street. Apparently, George Galloway's election was such a disturbing and frightening event that the Prime Minister himself had to come out and make a speech on the steps of Downing Street, something that very, very rarely happens in Britain. I understand that some people, when they heard that Rishi Sunak was going to make a speech of that nature, assumed that he was about to call a general election. So that tells you how rare speeches like this are. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss the speech or devote more time to this particular event, save to say that it was an astonishing speech. It talked about luridly about divisions in Britain, about threats to public order, about rampant danger from various people who conduct protests and that kind of thing, and requests, or really demands, that the police forces take action to police those kind of protests. It showed, again, clear traces of panic about it. This because one dissident politician has won a by-election. But anyway, there we go. No doubt at all about the fact that this recording is genuine. The German government has admitted as much. No reason to doubt, none at all, that it is an authentic record of what those two generals discussed. An extremely disturbing story altogether. German officers, NATO officers, talking about missile strikes on the territory of Russia, a nuclear power, a Cold War adversary, a once and perhaps future superpower, one with which all of these countries, Germany, France, Britain, the United States, Italy, Poland, are nominally at peace. Just saying. So there we go. Don't talk about that. Don't discuss the substance. Talk instead about how it was that the Russians acquired this recording and order a investigation into that. Now, there's a number of things I will say further about this affair. The first is a domestic German one, and that is that apparently Scholz himself was briefed about this recording whilst he was on a trip to Rome. And apparently there's pictures of him, there's discussions that he was apparently shocked by this conversation. He has publicly ruled out the supply of Taurus missiles to Russia and has spoken about that many, many times. I've said myself that to my knowledge, and I have very, very good reasons for believing this to be true, I've had some people comment to me in emails wondering whether this information can possibly be correct, but I believe it is correct. I have good reason to believe that Taurus missiles have, in fact, already been delivered to Ukraine and are, in fact, already present there. Just saying. I don't know it for an absolute fact, but as I said, I have very good reason to believe it. It could be, judging apparently from his startled reaction, that Scholz himself is unaware of this, that it was done without him being informed. It wouldn't surprise me. There are suggestions that he was taken aback by the nature of the discussions that appeared in this recording, and that he was surprised that conversations of this kind were taking place, apparently behind his back. It is confirmed in the German media, and by the way, in the Financial Times, that the German generals were indeed discussing a presentation that they were due to make to the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, and that this presentation has been requested by Pistorius himself. So again, it perhaps is a signal to Scholz that Pistorius is working behind his back, and Pistorius, as we know, has been positioning himself for some time to step in and take over from Scholz, who is becoming more and more unpopular in Germany. So it could be that there are internal elements of that going on. I'm just saying. I saw a discussion, again, it was, I believe, in the US media. Actually, I correct that. It was in the recent book by Glenn Deason on the Ukraine war and the new Eurasian world order. A fascinating book, an exceptional book, which we've just, Glenn Deason and I, discussed in a recent program, which is being published on the Duran. Anyway, I remember reading in this book that Barack Obama, back in 2014, had serious doubts and misgivings about the wisdom of supplying arms to Ukraine. He gave a presidential order prohibiting this from happening. The book reveals that the entirety of US officialdom disagreed with this order that the president himself had made, and the order was then circumvented and weapons started to be sent to Ukraine during the period of Obama's own presidency in violation of his order. It's unclear whether Obama himself was briefed about this, but I suspect that he probably had some idea of what was going on, and in his typical way, he chose to look in a different direction. So it could be that Scholz is facing something like the same problem, that he's made a decision, or at least says that he has, that Taurus missiles will not be supplied to Ukraine, and that the bureaucracy and members of his own party and his own defense minister are simply ignoring him and are going ahead and supplying Taurus missiles to Ukraine and are talking with each other about how they're going to be used. A bit speculative, but it would not surprise me if it was so. Anyway, on the topic of how the Russians, and it was obviously the Russians, got hold of this transcript, again, I want to make it very clear that I have no doubt whatsoever that they were not given this transcript by anybody from within NATO. But I understand that there are some murmurings in various places, I don't want to say too much about this, that the people who first got hold of this recording, who were listening into this conversation and recorded it, were not the Russians themselves, but the Chinese, if this discussion took place, or part of this discussion took place in Singapore, which is what the recording suggests, well, Singapore is a place where no doubt the Chinese do have an intelligence presence. There's even a report somewhere that apparently they can listen into any telephone conversation that takes place in Singapore. I've also been told that the Chinese have much more advanced hacking and eavesdropping technologies and capabilities than the Russians do, which is entirely possible. And besides that, I'm guessing that the Russians and the Chinese have long-standing intelligence cooperation agreements, and probably the Russians do the work in Europe and the Middle East, where they have a well-established presence and footprint, and they leave intelligence collection in Asia to the Chinese, and then of course the two sides exchange information with each other. It's a bit speculative, but it's plausible. All I would say is that if this recording was originally made by the Chinese and they passed it on to the Russians, then the Chinese will have had to be informed by the Russians and obtain their agreement before they published it. Just saying. There is another party which might also have been listening into the conversation and might have made that recording. I'm not saying, by the way, that it did. This is pure speculation on my part, but that is Singapore itself. Singapore has a very effective intelligence and security service. I've been told this by several people. And quite plausibly, they're keeping track on all of the discussions that take place from senior officials that visit the island, the city. I ought to say that Singapore is a proudly independent country. It has, under American pressure, agreed to impose some sanctions on Russia, though to say that it is unenthusiastic about them would be an understatement. Overall, it has reasonably correct relations with the Russians and has historically had relatively good relations with China. And of course, being an entrepot, it's likely to be a place where the intelligence communities of many countries operate, and the Singaporeans will have had good reason, therefore, to keep a close eye on what is going on. So it's not impossible that it was the Singaporeans who heard all of this, and judging from what I know about them, I can very easily imagine indeed that they would not be happy at all to see NATO officials in part conducting conversations, in part from their territory, discussing armed attacks on a nuclear power. I can imagine that the Singaporeans would look on that extremely unfavorably. Now, if it was the Singaporeans, it's quite plausible that they will have passed on this information to the Russians, but it's equally certain that they will have complained directly to the Germans and have told the Germans how unhappy they were about this whole conversation being conducted in this way, in which case, of course, the Germans will have also been told, almost certainly by the Singaporeans, that they were informing the Russians, in which case there would be no need for this investigation that we've been hearing so much about in Germany, because the Germans, or at least the German government, would already know how the Russians obtained the details. But I accept that this is speculative, and I don't know what Singapore's exact role was, and maybe they were not, well, quite probably they were not directly involved. But this is my program. I can air these possibilities. Why not? And certainly it's not a possibility I would entirely exclude. Anyway, there we go. So let's move on and talk about other things that are happening. Now, I have said in various programs that there is an atmosphere of panic starting to take hold in Europe. And I was very interested to read in the Daily Telegraph today an article that says exactly this. Now, to reiterate again, the Daily Telegraph is a right-wing conservative newspaper in Britain, very close to the British Conservative Party and to the British government. My sense is that it's also pretty close to Britain's permanent government as well. Anyway, the article begins with the words, Germany's elites run scared as Putin rains down death on Ukraine. Ukrainians are paying the price for Olaf Scholz's reluctance to confront Russia, which is, again, an interesting way of describing things. He should presumably take Germany into war. And it is by Daniel Johnson, who is a very well-known political commentator here, very much somebody of, well, I will say it straightforwardly, neocon views. He's absolutely a person who takes the standard neocon line on various things. I don't know him myself, but everything that I've heard about him suggests that he is a sincere and idealistic man, however misguided his ideals are, however dangerous they are, in my opinion. But anyway, he believes fervidly in the course he subscribes to, which is not any kind of recommendation, by the way, of the cause. But anyway, he goes on to say this: the spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of an unholy alliance of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. What is driving European politics at present is fear of who Russia might invade next if Ukraine were to collapse, fear of what might happen if Trump were to abandon NATO and leave Europe to the mercy of Putin. And so last week, when some 24 European leaders assembled in Paris for a Ukrainian summit, their host Emmanuel Macron gave voice to the rising sense of panic about the looming threats from East and West. Well, there you have it in the Daily Telegraph. Fear, panic across Europe. More and more people can see this. Daniel Johnson, I suspect, has his sources. He's probably in contact with all kinds of people. And we can see that the fear and panic is being noticed by all sorts of people, as other people as well. And we have all kinds of harebrained schemes floating around, harebrained schemes like the European powers establish some kind of defense line east of Odessa to protect Odessa from being captured by the Russians. Alternatively, that they garrison the border with Belarus so as to release the few thousand troops that Ukraine has defending this border, so that these troops can then be used to fight the Russians and presumably die or be wounded or captured there. There's been all kinds of schemes of this kind. The Taurus missile affair, to be clear, is itself a scheme, one that probably will achieve realization. But these are all schemes. They are not real solutions, actual solutions to the problem of Ukraine. To reiterate again, point that I made in previous programs, if we're talking about European armies, they're short of men, machines, and ammunition. They are not in a condition to take the Russian military on in Ukraine itself. Were they to try, all that would happen is that European soldiers would start returning to Europe in body bags, and given the current mood in Europe, European electorates would rapidly sour on that enterprise. What is driving these schemes, all of which appear to have a European origin, is, however, exactly that panic and fear that Daniel Johnson acknowledges. And note how he combines it with Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. When European neocons, as in the case of Daniel Johnson, talk about Donald Trump, we should realize that it isn't just Donald Trump. Donald Trump has now become a code word in Europe for the United States as a whole, because the Europeans, over the last few weeks, have begun to sense a sea change in American policy. And in fact, there's been an article in The Guardian, I'm not going to read it, by my old friend, Simon Tisdall. Old friend, of course, I don't know him, but I've read so many articles that in a kind of way I feel that I do. Anyway, for once, I think he's got it right. Tisdall rather sadly admits that in the United States today, there is little respect or liking for Joe Biden's mismanagement of foreign policy. The Americans, as Mark Milley said in that interview he gave to the Financial Times, have become sick and tired of war and no longer really believe in it any longer. And Simon Tisdall acknowledges that if Biden wants to run in the election as the foreign policy president who will keep the United States engaged around the world, active and involved in conflicts like the one in Ukraine, perhaps even escalating there, the American electorate is not going to like it, and they're more likely to vote for his adversary, Donald Trump. So there's a gradual understanding that there is a sea change in feeling on the part of large sections of the American population, that they're starting to turn against the war in Ukraine, and indeed foreign intervention in general. And there is also a gradual realization in Europe that some, by no means all, of the American elite are starting to, firstly, also tire of continuous interventionism, but also are starting to reassess priorities. And again, there's much discussion about the Republican Party and its views, the electoral support the Republican Party is receiving from its base, but also looming behind everything, there is the fear that many Europeans have that the advocates in the United States of the China First policy are now winning the debate over the more old-fashioned, classical neocons who remain fixated with Russia and want to prioritize Europe. That the China firsters were prepared to give the old-style neocons, with their obsession with Russia, a certain amount of space to conduct their Ukrainian project. Now that it's clear that the Ukrainian project is failing, that it can't succeed, that it's burning through too many resources, too many American resources, and is tying down the United States too far in Europe and in Ukraine, the China firsters are saying enough's enough. Let's focus on China instead, where the real challenge is, and let's let this war take its course and lead to the eventual result, because deep down we know that there is no threat to Europe from Russia, and we're just wasting resources there. And I think the Europeans sense this and understand this. They're still listening to people like Victoria Nuland and that faction, and they're prepared still to go along with their plans, but they're sensing that the Nuland-Kagan family, that faction within the American neocon movement, is losing ground, and it's the China firsters who are winning. All of this against the backdrop of increasing discontent in the United States with the distraction of all of the forever wars. And of course the Europeans know that without the United States, all of these plans are unachievable, that sending European troops to Ukraine without the Americans there is completely impractical. The Europeans also know that there is a general shortage of ammunition, of air defense missiles around the world. They've now figured out that there is no possibility of their increasing ammunition production. There is an important article about this in the American media today. I believe it is in Politica, saying that the Europeans have run into all kinds of supply chain and capacity issues, and have now come to understand that the prospect of their increasing ammunition production is simply non-existent. The Americans are increasing ammunition production, but they don't have enough to spare for Ukraine, and their production anyway is still quite low, and this production is not for sale to the Europeans because the Pentagon needs it for itself if it is going to be able to challenge China specifically. So come up with plans about scrabbling around Europe, the Middle East for shells. I've already unpacked the folly of that idea in a recent program. I think gradually there will be a dawning realization in Europe that none of this is practical, that the supply of drones to Ukraine can only achieve so much, that Ukraine is running out of men, that there is no support amongst the European public for sending troops to Ukraine. The Czech government has ruled it out. The Polish government has also ruled it out. German opinion, I think, would be solidly opposed to this. French ministers, taking their cue from Macron, are still trying to scare people in France into doing this. There was, I think it was Bruno Le Maire, anyway, one of the French ministers came out and said that It's much better to fight the Russians in Ukraine, because if the Russians win in Ukraine, the costs to Europe will be exorbitant. They will have to increase defense spending multiple times more than if Russia is defeated in Ukraine. But of course, he had to add the caveat that it's important for France and the Europeans to help Ukraine win without becoming directly involved in the war themselves. Of course, they are directly involved in the war themselves. We know that. Olaf Scholz disclosed it when he said that the French, as well as the British, are providing targeting programming to Ukrainian missiles. Just saying. But anyway, he still has to tell the European public, this French minister, that France mustn't get directly involved in the war, but it must help Ukraine achieve victory. And that's why we get all of these ridiculous and fantastic and implausible schemes. As I've discussed in many programs now, I'm not going to spend more time on it in this program, the one thing European leaders don't seem to be able to do is to do the obvious, which is finally to talk to the other side. They won't talk to the Russians. They won't see whether there's some way of at least achieving some kind of modus vivendi with the Russians, a live and let live situation. What Lenin, way back in the 1920s, called peaceful cohabitation. In other words, no real friendship or contact between Russia and the Europeans, but an acceptance that each is there to stay, and that the best thing to do is for each to leave the other alone. Nothing, no discussion of that, no discussion of the parameters of this issue. In fact, the Europeans are probably alarmed by yet another article that has just appeared in the American media. And this one has been in the Wall Street Journal. And it is addressing the taboo topic of the Istanbul Agreement, the one that was almost reached by Ukraine and Russia at the end of March and beginning of April 2022. And again, this article in the Wall Street Journal pretends that it is disclosing the underlying content of what was agreed in Istanbul. And this is beyond bizarre, because I remember Mikhail Podolyak, Zelensky's advisor, giving interviews at the time when the agreement was reached to the Financial Times, setting out in detail what the heads of agreement of the Istanbul Agreement were. And of course, Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov, has discussed them in detail in recent interviews also. So the Wall Street Journal isn't telling us anything that we don't actually already know. We learn, for example, or rather we don't learn, we are reminded that the Russians and Ukrainians in Istanbul, as part of this draft agreement, agreed that there would be a ceasefire, an armistice in effect, that the Russians would occupy the territory, remain in occupation of the territory that they occupied, and that the future status of Donbass and Crimea would be discussed in future negotiations, perhaps with discussions being taken forward by Putin and Zelensky himself. There was also agreements that Ukraine would significantly scale down its armed forces. We've now been given a lot more details about this. This is one piece of information that we've only really learned about in the last few weeks, but it's clear that the Ukrainians were prepared to scale down the size of their armed forces to a much greater extent than was disclosed by Mikhail Podolyak at the time. We also learned that there were lots of guarantees and protections for the Russian language, for Russian speakers in Ukraine. Again, the Ukrainians, Podolyak, basically talked down this question in his interviews with the Financial Times, but it's clear that these discussions did take place and that the Ukrainians were prepared to make commitments about this. We've learned from other sources, not from the Wall Street Journal, that the Ukrainians were even prepared to make important concessions about addressing the right wing, the far right, I'm choosing careful words here, in their midst, to address the Russian concern about the presence of these people and their activities. Again, it turns out the Ukrainians went much further here than they were prepared to acknowledge at the time. And last but not least, there were to be security guarantees for Ukraine, including, importantly, one from Russia. Importantly, those security guarantees would not extend to Donbass and Crimea, because the status of those two regions had yet to be determined, and the guarantees gave the Russians, the nature of the guarantees meant that the Russians were given a veto over the deployment of foreign troops, specifically NATO troops, in Ukraine, and the conduct of military exercises by those troops in Ukrainian territory. So, comprehensive agreement. We've had most of the details from the Ukrainians themselves back in March 2022. I discussed the agreement extensively at that time in programs that I made then, and we've had more details since, which, by the way, confirmed that the Ukrainians made more concessions, more substantive concessions than they were prepared to acknowledge at the time, but importantly, concessions which did not undermine the integrity and survival of Ukraine as a state. On the contrary, the Russians, in effect, were guaranteeing the continued survival of Ukraine as a state, and were even saying that they would not object if Ukraine continued on its almost certainly fruitless project of trying to join the European Union. So, there's been no mystery about this agreement, but there has been, again, a long omerta about it. It's been the case that for most of the period since the agreement was almost reached and then sabotaged by the Americans and the British. And by the way, President Erdogan of Turkey has now made more comments about the Istanbul agreement. He has made a speech about it. He said that he made huge efforts to reach this agreement, that it had almost been reached, and that it failed. And he makes it pretty clear, if you read his words carefully, who he blames for that. But anyway, there was a long policy over the last year and a half or so, since that agreement was reached, of not talking about it. And then, slowly, but not so slowly, suddenly, we're having all kinds of articles start to appear in The Spectator, in The National Interest, and now in the Wall Street Journal. And we've had very defensive comments about this agreement from Boris Johnson, who played a critical role in burying this agreement. And anyway, there's been all kinds of comments now in the media, but very tentative and nervous comments in the Western media about it. Now, I wondered why this was going on, and one possibility, and at least in Britain, is that an individual I know, Edward Roos, who was a former advisor of Boris Johnson's, has actually been asking questions, and that might have concentrated a few minds in a few places, but that perhaps needled a few people and made them think, well, that might be good cause, therefore, to come out and finally discuss this agreement. But I can't help but think that overall, and specifically in the United States, where the bulk of these articles is appearing, there is another reason as well, and that is that more and more people can see that the writing is on the wall, that Ukraine is going down, that there's nothing that can change the situation, that there is overwhelming opposition within the United States to the deployment of US forces in Ukraine, that the Europeans are not going to be able to do that by themselves. The United States, note, is not even prepared to agree a security agreement with Ukraine, as some of the European states have pretended to do. And that the United States is running out of its ability to continue to supply Ukraine with weapons, and the Ukrainians anyway are running out of men, and there is no real way to replace them. So people can start to see that the writing is on the wall and steps are being taken to try to establish the defenses, the alibis, once the inevitable game of recrimination begins. And inevitably, there will be criticisms that peace, an advantageous peace, was there for the taking in April 2022, and that the administration blocked it. So we've had a whole succession of articles in the national interest, which have sought to claim that this draft agreement hadn't really been agreed, and it was all going to fall apart anyway, and it wasn't for real. I've already discussed in the recent programs how that is an impossible thing to argue on its face. General Kuyat in Germany has discussed this in a masterly video that he has done and in many other places. And his friend, Michael Schulenberg, the UN official, he's written a brilliant article discussing how, well, both the origins of the war, the way in which opportunities for peace have been thrown away, and he also touches briefly, relatively briefly in that article, on the failure, rather the sabotage, of the Istanbul Agreement. So this line that was being taken in the national interest, that wasn't a real agreement, it hadn't been agreed, it would all have fallen apart, nothing actually was changed, there was no real pressure from the West. So the result is this whole story is a non-story. Well, that particular line of defense has collapsed before it was ever really presented. So now we have the latest attempt, and this is what this Wall Street Journal article is all about. It says that this agreement was a terrible agreement for Ukraine. The article actually tells us that it left Ukraine neutered as a country, that it was Putin's crushing terms on Ukraine. It was, of course, no such thing. And, of course, the implication is that the Biden administration was absolutely right, and NATO were absolutely right, and the Boris Johnson were absolutely right to sabotage this terrible agreement. And if the war continued and Ukraine goes down in smoke and is destroyed, well, don't blame Biden and the administration and the US government for sabotaging the prospect of peace, because that peace would have been an even worse outcome than what we're about to see. And the reason why things are going so bad and it's all going down to defeat is because the Republicans and people like that are blocking the further provision of essential aid to Ukraine. Now, the Europeans can read these articles this article in the Wall Street Journal, and they'll be able to draw their own conclusions, and they'll be able to realize that the mere fact that the Americans are now discussing the Istanbul Agreement is itself a sign that they're preparing for the fact that the war is lost. They're, in effect, coming round now and saying, well, don't blame us if the war was lost. If the war is lost, don't blame us for wrecking this agreement. It was a bad agreement to start with. Articles like this discussing a lost peace would not be appearing if there was a conviction in the United States that Ukraine was indeed heading for victory. So we see the general nervousness and the general fear. And of course, there's now been another article in the New York Times talking about the terrible situation on the battlefronts, that Ukraine failed to create proper fortified lines west of Avdiivka, that the Russians are pushing relentlessly forward. We will come to all of that in a moment, and that the situation on the front lines is very bad. I've had a private email, by the way, from someone who, writes actually to lots of people. I don't know how correct this is, but it might be true, that in fact the military situation is even worse than the New York Times is saying, because beyond the fact that there are no fortified lines, beyond Avdiivka, Ukraine anyway had only two relatively intact and strong formations left before Avdiivka fell. These were the 3rd Assault Brigade and the 5th Assault Brigade. And Zelensky and Syrsky took the disastrous decision to commit the 3rd Assault Brigade to the defense of Avdiivka, where it has been hammered and badly mauled, and that now only leaves one proper brigade with convincing armoured forces, the 5th Assault Brigade, left to act as a kind of fire brigade and strategic reserve. I don't know whether or not this is true, by the way, but anyway, I've had an email about this from someone, and this person has been an insightful commentator about the progress of the war. So now let's turn to the situation on the battlefronts themselves. We had pictures yesterday of Russian troops raising flags in Orlovka and Tonenka, these two villages, which lots of reports have been saying the Russians have captured. The Russian Defense Ministry has not yet confirmed the capture of these two villages, or indeed the capture of Berdici. And there are reports that there is in fact still fighting going on in the outskirts of these three villages, Toninka, Orlovka, and Berdici, with the Ukrainians perhaps still clinging on to some positions within them. I noticed a rather strange thing, which is that the Russian Defense Ministry has stopped providing updates, military updates, since Friday. There's been none this weekend. Perhaps there will be later today. But I do wonder, actually, whether, as the Russian Defense Ministry often does, they're holding back information in anticipation of the final capture of these three villages and of other locations along the front line. That was their practice in the Avdiivka fighting. And for that reason, they decided to hold back their reports because they don't want to disclose too much about rather important ongoing military operations. But anyway, we've seen Russian flags raised over Orlovka and Tonenka. There are multiple reports that Zelensky and Syrsky have rushed reinforcements to the area to try to stem the Russian tide, and that those forces went to Tonenka and Orlovka. Again, General Tarnavsky and the Tavria group are once more telling us that the situation has been stabilized, which, on the basis of the information we have, doesn't seem to be the case at all. And I know that there are people with much more understanding of things than me who are questioning the entire logic of what Syrsky and Zelensky are doing. They're saying that trying to hold the Russians back in places like Tonenka, Orlovka, and Berdici is wrong. That is simply burning through more Ukrainian reserves, more Ukrainian troops, and more Ukrainian equipment, accelerating the coming collapse, and that if Ukraine's real plan is to try to hold back the Russians, the better thing to do would be to withdraw towards a river barrier further west, and that this makes a much more convincing defense line than the areas around these three villages and the open fields between these villages where Ukrainian troops are obliged to move and where they are susceptible to very heavy bombing by the Russians. Anyway, the fact that the Russians have not only raised their flags over Tonenka and Orlovka, but that the Defense Ministry has allowed film of this fact to be published suggests to me that the Defense Ministry anticipates, the Russian Defense Ministry anticipates that it will be able to publish confirmation of the capture of these two villages very soon. Anyway, lots of fighting going on there, but nobody, I think, certainly not the New York Times, appears to deny the direction of travel. Ukrainians burning up machines and losing lots of men trying to hold back the oncoming Russian tide in an area where there are no prepared defences and where it would make more sense for them to pull back. Now, we've also had further confirmation of the destruction of two more Ukrainian air defense systems. Yesterday, the Russians published film of the destruction of another S-300 launcher system. I think this is the third of these that has been destroyed by the Russians over the last few days. And this morning, I saw pictures of the destruction of a book launcher vehicle. This is a more mobile system. Apparently, the Ukrainians long since ran out of missiles for their book launchers, and they actually now launch Western-supplied missiles from these launchers, that they're kind of Frankenstein system, or whatever the facts. One appears to have been destroyed. So the Ukrainians losing more air defense systems at astonishing speed. And note that the Ukrainians have no means for replacing these systems. We're still getting, for example, from the Germans, announcements of further weapons deliveries to Ukraine. The Germans are about the only people left in the West currently supplying Ukraine with weapons, at least that I'm aware of. The Americans, the British, and the French are not doing so. I don't think the Italians are either, but the Germans still are. Then it's clear that they're running out of their ability to supply Ukraine with air defense systems. There's no word, for example, of replacements for the Patriot systems, which we know Ukraine has now lost. And, well, we see that Ukraine, in its desperate attempts to try to hold back the Russian bombing, has been forced, or at least has decided, most unwisely, to deploy its air defense assets to the contact line, with the result that the Russians are just destroying them very, very quickly. Now, the Ukrainians, for their part, are still claiming that they've shot down Russian fighter jets. And yesterday they claimed to have shot down 2 more Sukhoi 34s. There's no independent corroboration of this. There is no sign of any slackening of the Russian bombing. The Russian Defense Ministry yesterday pointedly published a video of a Sukhoi 35 jet flying over Avdiivka, in other words, on the conflict line, with no sign that it was experiencing any special threat from these Ukrainian air defense missiles. And I notice that even those commentators, independent commentators, like, for example, Dima at the Military Summary Channel, who have up to now been tending to take Ukrainian claims to shoot down Russian aircraft, at least who have been giving the Ukrainians the benefit of the doubt about these claims. Anyway, in his very last program, Dima appeared to be suddenly a lot more skeptical. I became skeptical about these Ukrainian claims some time ago. I'm just saying. So, the Russians still bombing, still advancing in the Avdiivka area, apparently going to other places. They've consolidated their positions in Krasnogorovka, the southern part of Krasnogorovka, north of Marinka. There's reports that they've also advanced. They made significant advances west of Marinka through the village of Georgievka, that they, after a certain pause, they've achieved real advances there. And perhaps most worrying for the Ukrainians of all, there are now reports that the Russians have achieved some kind of breakthrough in Ivanivska, this village to the southwest of Bakhmut, a major fortified position held by Ukraine, one which the Wagner forces never attacked, never seemed to have really tried to attack. The Russians are fighting well inside Ivanivska. There's some reports that they control around 2/3 of this village. There was even a report that I saw, but I'm not sure that this is true, that the Russians have raised their flags over part of Ivanivska, but I've seen no pictures of this, and none of the places where I see, which I mainly rely upon for claims of that kind, are reporting it. But it does look as if Ivanivska itself is about to fall. And the Russians relentlessly bombing Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka, the two small towns west of Bakhmut, and of course of Ivanivska and Bogdanovka, which they would need to capture before advancing further towards Kramatorsk. So all of the indications are that the Russians are continuing to hammer the Ukrainians, and that the Ukrainians are continuing to suffer very heavy losses. Meantime, perhaps unsurprisingly, in all the circumstances, General Syrsky, who is loyally carrying out President Zelensky's orders to hold every millimeter of ground right across the battlefronts, and who is clearly coming in for more and more criticism from other commanders in the Ukrainian army. I discussed yesterday reports that have appeared on Ukrainian telegram channels that Ukrainian commanders of brigades have written to Zelensky asking for Syrsky to be sacked and for Zaluzhny to be brought back. Well, Syrsky may be facing criticisms of this kind, seeing the situation on the battle lines go wrong. He's taken to sacking commanders, brigade commanders, and lower level commanders himself. And there's also reports that he's publishing further criticisms of his subordinates, of lower level commanders, presumably the commanders who are criticizing him. So it looks as if, with the situation becoming increasingly bad on the battle lines, Syrsky is coming under pressure and criticism, and he's responding with criticism of his own, and he's making decisions to sack experienced and perhaps even well-liked commanders and replacing them instead with people who he apparently feels he can trust. And one of those who he apparently feels he can trust is none other than General Tarnavsky of the Tavria Group, the general who failed in the summer offensive, the general who failed in the defense of Avdiivka. He apparently remains in post. There is no word so far that he's been sacked, and there are apparently again stories that this is the case because he has somehow managed to ingratiate himself with General Syrsky. Well, I don't know about all of the gossip and the rumours, but Syrsky's statements of criticism of his commanders and of the steps he's having to take to remove unsuccessful commanders, well, it seems to me that those speak for themselves. So, a deteriorating situation. What is going to come in the end of all of these harebrained schemes we're seeing being discussed in the West at the moment? Well, I have to say, I think it is more than likely that the Germans will eventually announce the delivery of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. As I said, I have good reason to believe that they are actually already there. That's something I'm going to discuss. I can't discuss more about But anyway, that the Taurus missiles are already in Ukraine, even if Olaf Scholz doesn't know that, even if some German generals, aren't aware of it either. I suspect that Pistorius, Nuland, and the hardliners in Germany, Baerbock, Habeck, and the others who want the Taurus missiles to be used will get their way. I expect that Nuland, Kagan, the other hardliners in Washington who want the ATACMS missiles to be supplied to Ukraine will also get their way. I suspect that there will be attacks on the Kerch Bridge. I'm not making any prediction as to what that attack will achieve. It could be, in fact, it's highly likely, that there will be a Russian retaliation. But in terms of the general direction of the conflict, none of this is going to change anything. I think that all of the talk of sending European troops to Ukraine is going to melt away. I don't think that this is a viable plan. I think the Europeans know it. Going back to Daniel Johnson, says a growing body of opinion across Europe, across the continent, believes that the war is unwinnable for Ukraine, and a large majority is actively pro-Russian. Well, I don't believe the second. I mean, I don't think there's any kind of minority that is actively pro-Russian. I've seen no sign of it. There is simply no consensus in favour of stepping up European aid to Ukraine. And even Daniel Johnson appears to accept that this is coming, basically, the idea of sending troops to Ukraine is coming too late now. And he also mentions something which many, many people are talking about, that the relationship between Scholz and Macron has already broken down in the face of recriminations, the recriminations that already exist. But anyway, I don't expect European troops to go to Ukraine in any significant numbers. Of course, there are special forces already operating there and people operating there in the guise of mercenaries and that kind of thing. But I think that the military people understand that it will make no difference, and the political leaders understand that the will of the European public is completely opposed to this bizarre scheme. So it's a scheme that's not going to fly. The Americans are not going to join. There's problems with the F-16s. They might not be able to operate effectively. The Russians are getting stronger all the time. What we're seeing is the last stages of denial before the acknowledgement, the final acknowledgement of the inevitable, which is that Russia is going to win in Ukraine. Now, Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama has spoken about this. He says the following. He's done a piece about the situation in Ukraine, and he says this: the current political uproar in Europe about the war, and the US about the war, is an acknowledgement of the fact that Russia is certain to win this fight. I do not expect any serious consequences coming from it. It will simply take a few more weeks of discussions until resignation sets in. I think that is right. I would qualify that by saying that I still think that we're going to get the ATACMS missiles and the Taurus missiles turning up in Ukraine and be used in action. I think the Russians will adjust to these missiles. I know about the difficulties in intercepting each of these missiles, but I think that the Russians have repeatedly shown that they find ways round. I think that Western militaries, having neglected air defense themselves, underestimate the capabilities of the Russian air defense system. The Russians, by the way, on that topic, have just conducted an exercise, I believe, in the Arctic, testing the S-500 air defense system, their newest air defense system, which is apparently capable, or so the Russians say, of intercepting hypersonic missiles. And of course, alongside the S-500, there is the S-550, about which we know very little, but which is also entering service, and which also has apparently, a battlefield role. So the Russian air defense system continues to develop and advance and becomes denser and stronger. So I think the Russians will adapt once these missiles are used. And of course, they're warning the West that if it goes too far, the Russians have the capability to launch missiles of their own. And since they're hypersonic, the West has no ability to intercept them. And since the West has given so many of its air defense systems to Ukraine, or at least the Europeans have, there are now anyway major gaps in the European air defense system, which of course makes the Europeans more vulnerable still. So I think there'll be some things happening. I don't think that nothing will come of these discussions. But overall, I do agree with Bernhard's assessment. Russia is now universally understood to be winning the war. There was first panic, then there are the various schemes, of which Macron's is the most developed. And then once it becomes obvious that none of these schemes will work, the resignation will finally set in. Whether that resignation is accompanied with any sort of diplomatic outreach to the Russians is another matter. Whether the Russians would be prepared for any kind of negotiations is another matter. Again, I strongly suspect, again looking at this article in the Wall Street Journal, that the Americans themselves are not prepared to negotiate with the Russians about Ukraine or about security issues in Europe. And I doubt that the Europeans will be prepared to negotiate with the Russians without the Americans. So, we're going to see an inevitable Russian victory in Ukraine. Ukraine itself might negotiate. Glenn Deason and I had a discussion with Nikolai Petro about that possibility. But for the moment, that looks very distant. More likely than not, there will be a clear-cut Russian victory in Ukraine. The divisions in Europe will harden. The problems for Europe will grow. The Eurasian states will converge still further, and the Americans will drift away and start new adventures in the Pacific and the South China Sea and the Straits of Taiwan, unless, of course, a new administration steps in and brings sanity to the ongoing madness. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Don't forget that you can also check check out, well, support us via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. You can also check out our shop, links under this video also. And if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's more from me soon. Probably soon more news from the battlefronts. That, of course, is what is driving events. And perhaps we'll be able soon to revisit the situation in the Middle East, which remains very unstable, and where also the West's and the United States' diplomatic position is continuing to erode. Anyway, that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.